Well, that's a good time.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Mitch Thompson. I am Vice President of the Humanists of Minnesota. I want to welcome everybody to our October community gathering. We will have a presentation today by Professor Timothy Johnson. It's great to see many of the members and our friends here today. And a special welcome to any visitors who have never been here before. We really appreciate you coming out and your attendance. A couple of quick announcements. If people don't know, the bathroom is out there and to the right. Around 4:30, after a question and answering session, we will have a social hour. And we really do hope that you want to stay and socialize and maybe catch up with some new friends, make some new friends, or get better acquainted. There will be refreshments, and we try to keep it a self-sustaining thing, so there will be donations to help cover our costs. Our next community gathering will be November 19th at this at FUS again. It'll be from 3 to 5:30, and that one will be about the elections and kind of a recap of what happens earlier in November. And that one we are calling "The Elections Are Over, Now What?" And I believe we're doing it as a panelists. Yeah, we'll have panelists discussing that, what happened. So before I have Audrey Kingstrom introduce our speaker, I just want to give you a little bit of background about our organization. Humanists Minnesota is a secular community for ethical living. We are committed to the well-being of all and the sustainability of the planet, embracing the concept of human flourishing. We are home for those looking for a community of naturally curious, compassionate, and rational people who gather for friendship, personal growth, doing good together, and normalizing the non-religious naturalist worldview. And I think that's an important part of what we do. Very important part is normalizing a non-religious view. We are an all-volunteer organization. We depend on goodwill, service, and generosity of our members and friends to further our mission and to use an often found phrase in the religious community, spread the word. We're also a very active organization. We organize primarily through Meetup. And before I came to this meeting, I just did a little sample of some of the stuff we have coming up. Think Book Club. We'll be discussing Ezra Klein's Why We Are Polarized on October 18th. This will happen online from 7 to 9. We have a mix of stuff that's online and in person. One of our groups, Humanists in Action, are doing a service event for an organization called Food Group Warehouse. They're going to pack up food, and that eventually will be distributed to nearly 200 food shelves around the city. Food Group is a secular, non-faith-based, non-profit organization whose mission is to serve hunger needs of our changing communities. That happens October 19th from 1 to 9 or 1 to 3. Humanist Online Happy Hour and a Half happens October 21st from 5 to 6:30, and as the name indicates, that's online. The Secular Grief Support Group meets November 3rd, right here at FUS from 7 to 8:30. And again, this is just a sampling of a lot of things that happens under the umbrella of Humanists of Minnesota. You can find all this on our Meetup page, and more importantly, you can find it through our HumanistsMN.org website, which is a great place to sign up for our newsletter, or become involved with our organization, or to become a member of our organization, which we strongly encourage membership to our organization because it gives us the opportunity to do events like today and all the other things that I mentioned and all the things happening through Meetup. It also allows us to do things like we've done billboards last year, we're going to do billboards this year, and convene a secular group or at the Capitol, secular caucus, that's what we're for. And we're going to do whatever we can to help that group become more known and be able to influence what happens at the Minnesota Capitol. So becoming a member helps us have the funds to do that. You can also donate, of course, in large or small amounts at any time if you want. Again, you can find all that information find out how to do that through our website, HumanistsMN.org. Also, we have a number of groups that meet regularly that help run our organization, and we always can take more help for those groups. Like, for example, this event, we can use help for the community gatherings. We also have a marketing committee, a media committee, a membership committee, a programming committee, which Audrey runs, and a social action committee. So getting involved in any way, even if it's with your time or your expertise in any of these things or any knowledge, is how this organization best flourishes. And so whether you're new or have been attending our events for a while, we invite you to help us magnify the inclusive message of humanism. Becoming a dues-paying member or getting involved in our groups, but most of all, we appreciate you attending our events and being part of our community. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and I'm sure eventually TikTok or whatever new platform becomes available in the very near future that some of us old people will have a hard time figuring out. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey Kingstrom, who will introduce our speaker for today. And thanks again for coming. And if you have any questions, a lot of us are walking around with these little badges that say we're on the board. Please come up and talk to us, ask us anything, and we will help direct your questions or help find a place for you to move forward with us. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitch. Just a couple of fine points to what Mitch just said, and that is, I have some sign-up sheets in the back. So if you want to peruse those during the social time and say yeah, maybe I would help up with marketing or at a community gathering. Sure, put down your name and your email, and we'll be in touch. And also, just to say who's going to be involved next month at our program on sort of an assessment of the election is Christopher Chapp, who's a political science professor at St. Olaf College, and he's going to focus on the congressional races. And Tori Van Oot is a reporter for Axios Twin Cities, and she's going to analyze the state and local contests for us. So that's who's on board for next month. And so I do hope you'll join us. It should be common knowledge, something else to say about us as humanists, is that we are lifelong learners. We are champions of democracy and advocates of an inclusive civil rights, not just for the few. Hence, we are very interested in and concerned about the direction of our current Supreme Court. And that is why we have invited Timothy Johnson, the Horace T. Morse Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Law at the University of Minnesota, to speak to us today. Tim is a nationally recognized expert on U.S. Supreme Court oral arguments and decision-making. As a prolific researcher and writer, he has published several books, and his research has appeared in a variety of academic journals. Further, Tim's legal and political commentary has been covered by a wide variety of publications, including The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, NPR, C-SPAN, Slate, USA Today, ABC, and CNN. We are in good hands today to help us understand the Supreme Court. And he has a reputation for being a very good teacher as well, having won the 2018 American Political Science Association's Distinguished Teaching Award. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Tim Johnson.
I appreciate it. Do I need this? Are you okay if I don't use that? You need it. All right, I'll use it. I have a loud voice, so I never know if I should really use it or not. So when Audrey emailed me, this is the kind of talk that I like to give, and I couldn't say no. I mean, even though it was on a football Saturday afternoon, it was I know they did, although I'm not a Gophers fan, sadly. Although I sort of am, having been there for 22 years, they didn't play very well today. But I could not give a talk to a group like the Minnesota Humanists. I was delighted to be invited, so thank you very much. Thanks for the kind words of introduction. I've been talking for some time about the Roberts Court because we are now 17 years into John Roberts' time as Chief Justice. He's gone through four, I think he's on his fifth, what we call natural court. That means when there's turnover, it's a new Roberts Court every time there's new turnover. And so with Obama having 3 appointees, actually we're on the 6th, then Trump having 3 and Biden having 1, we're now on Roberts' 6th court. And he will probably have a number more, although it seems as though at this point, this natural court with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson taking the oath of office on the first Monday of this month will probably be settled as this court for possibly 8, 10, 12 years, depending on what happens in 24, depending on what happens to the Senate this year. And so it is a good question to ask, what is happening with the Roberts Court, and how long will this last? But you can't, especially as a social scientist, it's very difficult to say, let's just talk about the Roberts Court. And so it's almost always better to put a court into perspective, or any political or legal phenomenon into perspective. And so that's why the title I actually have here is Comparing the Roberts Court with the Warren Court, because in order to understand just how conservative the Roberts Court is, it's actually really interesting, and also, as I said, social scientifically, will give you a more proper understanding and context of the Roberts Court to know what happened during the Warren Court era. And I actually don't mean the entirety of the Warren Court era. Because for those of you who do remember the Warren Court era, not from your history books, and I'm sure there are some of you all here today, the Warren Court did not begin as an especially liberal court. It wasn't until you get to 63, a little bit in the late 63 term, and 64 to 68 really, that last term of the Warren Court, that the Warren Court becomes deemed as the most liberal court in the history of the United States. And so I want to begin with this comparison. So I'm going to show you the only real quantitative data I will show you today is one figure, and I'll explain the figure. It's pretty easy to get what's going on with the figure. And then I'm going to talk about what the Warren Court did and how far they pushed civil liberties and civil rights in particular in the United States. And then that can take us to the Roberts Court and see how far the Roberts Court is pushing civil liberties and civil rights, as well as some other areas of law, the exact opposite direction. And then I'll make an argument about why the two courts are very similar despite being in polar ideological opposite directions. So let me begin with an ideological comparison. And this comes from an article that a colleague at Michigan State and I just finished writing a month or so ago, as we were asked to write sort of a overview of what happened this past term on the United States Supreme Court. And we didn't look at any particular case. Other folks in the edited volume wrote about particular cases, but we were writing just about what happened generally by the Roberts Court. And so this figure, the y-axis here is the percent decisions in any given term beginning in 1937 and ending in the 2021 term were conservative. And we can get into how I define liberal and conservative during Q&A, but essentially when you're thinking civil liberties and civil rights, a liberal decision increases civil liberties or civil rights, and a conservative decision pulls them back, right? Gives the government the ability to take away those civil liberties or civil rights, or at least finds in favor of them. So if you think about it in those terms, that's where we're getting sort of this definition of liberal and conservative. So we have percentage of liberal decisions here, and then simply a timeline from 37 to 21. And the red horizontal line here shows that, in fact, the Roberts Court in the 2021 term is the single most ideologically conservative court in the history of the United States Supreme Court. But the question we ask in that article is the Roberts Court unique in being that, it's unique in being that conservative, but is it that unique in being that so far in one direction? And the answer is it's actually not, because if you compare the Roberts Court to the height of the Warren Court was just as ideologically as far to the left in its heyday, that 65, 66, 67 terms, as the Roberts Court was today. So yes, the Roberts Court is unique in that it's the most conservative court, but it's not unique to the extent that it's the most extreme court in the history of the United States Supreme Court. And so that is sort of where I want to begin with the comparison, just so you know where the Roberts Court stands, right? I taught my students in the mid to late 90s that the Rehnquist Court was and would be forever probably the single most conservative court era in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was. At the time, it was in the 90s here. And then the Roberts Court beats them in the 2021 term that ended in June of 2022. So let me take us back in history a little bit before I talk about this term, as well as the current term, back to these terms in the heyday of the Warren Court. And so here's the Warren Court circa 1967. This may be my favorite court in the history of the court. And you will know it's one of my favorites because one of our sons is named after Thurgood Marshall. My wife would not let us name him Thurgood. She thought maybe he would get beaten up on the playground if his name was Thurgood, so his middle name is Marshall. And he knows very proudly that he's named after Thurgood. But this is, and you think about this despite the fact that we've got Republican appointees on this bench. The most liberal justices ever to sit on the bench are sitting in this picture. Hugo Black, who, by the way, being as liberal as he was on the court, began his career as a member of the KKK in Alabama as he was running for Senate in the teens and the 20s. We've got Bill Douglas, who by far is one of the top 5 most liberal justices ever to sit. We've got Earl Warren, the chief of the court. I'm sorry, that's Hugo Black, that's John Harlan. I apologize, I mixed them up. Bill Douglas is here, Bill Brennan, who is perhaps the single most liberal justice ever to sit on the bench. And then we get Abe Fortas, who comes near to that as well, Potter Stewart, Byron White, the sole Kennedy appointee, and then Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American to sit on the bench. But note that 4 of those justices up there, as I said, were Republican appointees, and 2 of them were named by Eisenhower when he was asked the question at the end of his 8 years, did you make any mistakes in office? And he said, I made 2, and they're both on the United States Supreme Court, Warren and Brennan. Warren is a Republican governor of California. Brennan was a Republican operative for the GOP in New Jersey and a very, very good party man. And they both end up being 2 of the top 5 most liberal justices ever to sit on the bench. And then, as I said, you've got Byron White, who was JFK's appointee, and then LBJ getting on Abe Fortas as well as Thurgood Marshall, which was obviously highly controversial because why in 1967 would we want African Americans on the United States Supreme Court? But having been Solicitor General, the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for so many years, he was absolutely the right choice for LBJ at the time. So you've got this court, and what do these 8 white men and this 1 African-American man do? And I gave you sort of the hint at the start of the talk, and that is that they increased civil liberties and civil rights to the greatest extent that we'd ever seen in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Now, that's sort of a misnomer, because prior to the 1940s, the U.S. Supreme Court almost never spoke about civil liberties and civil rights. There was a little bit in the 20s where there were some free speech cases, but prior to the 20s and really in the 40s after the New Deal era and after FDR was able to get so many of his appointees on the bench. In fact, FDR tied George Washington with the most appointments to the bench in the history of the United States at 9. FDR fully turned over the court during his time in the White House. But the court didn't talk about these issues because we were still a new country. I mean, think about it. Even as the century turns to 1900, we're a new nation. And so the court is mostly concerned with economic issues. How much regulation can you put on the economy, on big business? And then really fleshing out the powers of the federal government, as well as the relationship between the federal government and state governments. So it's not until we get into this post-New Deal era that we start switching. The court switches its docket almost 180 degrees and is dealing so much less often with governmental cases and with economics cases and its civil liberties cases. So what does the Warren Court do to us? It increases the federal government's power over race. in 54 and then again in 57 and Brown 1 and Brown 2, it says that we are going to, for now and evermore, say that separate but equal is unconstitutional, and we're going to make sure, although it obviously didn't happen very quickly, if at all yet in 2022, make sure that there is more equality among the races. And then, of course, it also had to decide in 1958 a case that nobody ever talks about, Aaron versus Cooper, and Cooper says, all of these southern states that are refusing to follow Brown v. the Board of Education, you have to follow our decisions. And no one ever talks about Cooper. But Cooper is the case where the court finally wags its finger at the southern states and says, when we say jump, the only thing you can ask us is how high. Okay, and that's really to sort of force the issue of the integration of races in the United States. The biggest increase in rights for the criminally accused in the history of the United States, and even today the court has not gotten fully conservative on these issues, and I can talk about why during Q&A, but the court decides Mapp versus Ohio in 1961 that says if the police gather evidence illegally, it cannot be used against you in a court of law. They decide Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963 that gives everybody the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, even if it's just for a traffic court case and you want counsel and you can't afford one, the state will provide one for you. And of course, perhaps most famously decides Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, and you all know what Miranda gives us, and that's our Miranda rights. As I said to my students on Thursday, you all have your Miranda rights memorized, and if for no other reason than Law and Order is on TV and streaming 24/7, and you hear Lenny and whatever particular partner he has on the given year giving people their Miranda rights, and so they are really inured in our brains, and it's the Warren Court that gives us these rights. It increases First Amendment rights, and by that I don't just mean free speech rights, I mean freedom of religion, as well as religious establishment cases as well. In 1962, in Engel versus Vitale, the court says we're no longer going to have prayers, mostly, well, actually exclusively Christian prayers read in public schools before the school day. There's a series of other cases that says you can no longer read Bible verses, you can't read the Lord's Prayer, because we're going to have this separation of church and state. In Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, perhaps the last of the highly salient, famous or infamous, depending on your viewpoint, cases of the Warren Court, they decide Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is a free speech case, which dramatically increases the freedom of speech and dramatically makes it more difficult for the federal government, or state governments for that matter, to scale back their freedom of speech rights. The dirty little irony of Brandenburg is that the litigant in the case whose freedom of speech rights were protected was the Ku Klux Klan. And the Warren Court said, we're going to protect whomever we need to protect as long as their freedom of speech rights are being protected. And so that case is controversial because it's the KKK who is being protected, but the Warren Court says we would have protected anybody who wanted to march in Ohio who wanted to invoke their freedom of speech rights. And then finally, the court creates, and you will note that I use this word here, and I know that these are difficult to see because we're in a much more brightly lit room, but I use this word, created the right to privacy. And this is absolutely positively true. The right to privacy does not exist anywhere in the Constitution. It's nowhere in the Bill of Rights. It's nowhere in the other 27 amendments. It's not in any, that word privacy is not in any of the articles. But the justices had been marching towards the right to privacy, beginning actually with their cases on the Fourth Amendment rights that protect you from illegal searches and seizures. And those cases were always insinuating this freedom or this liberty that you've got some privacy from the government. And finally in Griswold, which of all things is a case about married couples wanting to use contraception, the court says there is this thing called the right to privacy, and where they found it, where Douglas ultimately finds that right to privacy in what he calls the penumbras of the Constitution. I love the word penumbras. It's a great 25-cent word, but penumbra just means the gray areas. That if you read between the lines of the First Amendment, you see you've got the freedom of association. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, you've got the right to be protected from illegal searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment gives you the freedom of, or the liberty of due process. And all of those, when combined, as well as with due process of the 14th Amendment, insinuates between the lines that we have this right to privacy. And then there's this amendment that nobody talks about, and it's the 9th Amendment. People scream and holler about the 10th Amendment, states' rights versus federal power, and they talk about the 11th Amendment, the ability or the protection that states have against people suing them, but no one really knows what the 9th Amendment says. And I can't quote it because I don't memorize things very well. My wife can tell you that any time of the day. But the 9th Amendment says, for all intents and purposes, this: just because we gave you these liberties in the other 8 amendments doesn't mean you don't have other rights. And so when you add up the gray areas of the first, actually I missed the 3rd Amendment, which says that the government can't force you to quarter soldiers. But so when you add up the 1st, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 14th, along with the 19th sort of catch-all, Douglas says, and his colleagues agree, you've got the right to privacy. And that flies in the face of what Robert Bork said during his confirmation hearings in 1987, when he said, you can't have the right to privacy. I want the right to privacy, but we don't have it because that word's not in the Constitution anywhere. And Bork said point blank, do I want the government coming into my bedroom when my wife and I are sleeping or doing whatever else we might be doing? No, but the Constitution does not stop the government from doing so. And Griswold, and then ultimately what leads to reproductive freedom in Roe versus Wade, comes out of the Warren Court. So the Warren Court, right, these accounts of these cases that I teach in my common law cases every single year jive with the data I showed you in the first slide. These are all incredibly liberal decisions that say we are going to protect people much more strongly at this point from government encroachment on our liberties. Okay? So that's the setup. That's the context for where are we at now in 2022. And I'm going to give you the setup, a similar sort of rundown of early cases that the Roberts Court decided. And by early, I actually mean 2005 to 2016. So we're going to get within 6 years of where we are now. I'll give you a quick rundown of the 2021 controversial cases and then give you a sense of what's going to be decided this term. I'll make some concluding remarks and then take questions, because that's the better part of these discussions, are the questions. Then you listen to me for 40 minutes or so. But let me talk about the Roberts Court. And I'm going to give you 3 versions of the Roberts Court, at least the 3 initial versions. Even though there are 6, as I said, different Roberts Courts, I'm just going to give you 3 here. And then the next slide, you'll see the current court. So through 2009, where David Souter sat on the bench, G.W. Bush's probably, or G.H.W. Bush's big mistake. And I will say that despite James Carville saying in 1992 that the entire presidential race was about the economy stupid, and that was his phrase, right? And if you watch any documentary or read anything about the Clinton campaign in 1992, that phrase is everywhere. It's the economy stupid. That's all they pushed. The other reason that Bush lost was that he put David Souter on the bench. And the far right was so angry with him because Souter ended up being the ultimate stealth candidate and ends up being one of the most liberal justices on the bench during his tenure. And you'll know, if you haven't already, that these court eras, or these natural courts, are arrayed from left to right, liberal to conservative. And I take some issue with them. They come from particular cases. So for instance, Justice Sotomayor is more liberal than Justice Kagan, and ergo here she's more to the left. But in this particular case that I took the image from, she was more moderate apparently in her vote. But so through 2009, Souter is still on the bench. And then Stevens leaves in 10, and they are replaced by Justices Sotomayor and Justice Kagan. And then you will note that all the way through 2020, we just have the 2 new justices from the Trump era, and that would be Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and that gets us where we are today. Actually, I don't have that picture yet, so I'll back up. It is these courts that decided a variety of cases, and note what I have here, that they're deciding on a bunch of civil liberties and civil rights cases, but sometimes they actually made liberal decisions. So the Roberts Court, at least early on, was not radical in the way that it is today. And if we go back to the images, you can see why. Kennedy is at the center of these first 2 court eras, the first 2 Roberts Court eras. And there are 4 more liberal justices and 4 more conservative justices on either side of it. And Kennedy was the quintessential moderate. Just as Sandra Day O'Connor was, just as Lewis Powell was, just as Potter Stewart was. And so you are not going to get radical decisions, at least many of them, because Kennedy was the one who always had to be convinced. It is not until there is a clear 5-person majority here by the time we get to 2018 that the court can start doing much more radically conservative things. And even then, the chief, who is very conservative, and if you read any biography of the chief, Roberts, as great a guy as he is, as nice a guy as he is, as brilliant as he is incredibly, incredibly conservative. And so everybody on the left knew that when he became the median justice, that things would change, with an exception. And that is that Roberts is the quintessential institutionalist. He knew that if the court did things that were too radical, people would not follow the court, people would not like the court, and the court would be in a position that it is in today. And that is in complete disarray with approval ratings that are sitting in the 20s. So Roberts pulled back, right? It is no wonder, despite that Roberts votes against same-sex marriage, Roberts is the key vote to uphold Obamacare. Why? Because he knows that if the court strikes the ACA, or I guess we'll stick with Obamacare, millions of people are going to lose their health care, and the court is going to be seen as a villain. And it will not be the court that will be seen as a villain. It will be the Roberts court that will be seen as a villain. So he was not going down in history as the guy that took away people's health care. And that's what he does in the Obamacare case. But in terms of civil liberties and civil rights, despite how conservative the court is, Kennedy is a swing vote in Obergefell. It's the Roberts court that upholds the liberty of same-sex marriage. And that's considered one of the most liberal decisions of the 21st century. On the other hand, the court says from here on out, beginning in Heller in 2010, we are absolutely saying that the Second Amendment is only about the individual right to bear arms. It's not about the militia. Scalia says in Heller that the militia clause, that is, in order to have a regulated militia, that clause means nothing. If Scalia had his way, he would have taken an eraser to the Second Amendment and erased the militia clause and reads the Second Amendment as only an individual right. But note this, remember my definition of liberal decisions. This is actually a liberal decision legally. It's a very conservative decision politically, but legally it's increasing people's rights because it's protecting to the nth degree people's right to bear arms. And then the Roberts Court applies freedom of speech to corporations in Citizens United. And it doesn't just apply to corporations, but to unions. Again, a legally liberal decision because it's upholding individual liberties, but sort of bizarre liberal decision because the notion and if you go and read Citizens United, the contortions that Roberts had to go through in that decision to make corporations meet the definition of an individual, to give corporations/unions the same right that people have in the United States. And that's where that decision goes off the rails and becomes a much more conservative decision than a liberal one, because I don't believe anybody, including the framers, thought that corporations would enjoy the same liberties that you and I do. And then the court really starts changing its interpretation of the religious freedom component of the First Amendment, as well as the separation of church and state component, the Establishment Clause. And in Hobby Lobby, the court says that if we have what they call a closely held corporation, and that was Hobby Lobby, that's that store like Michael's that sells crafting supplies and other sorts of supplies, has a strongly held religious belief, then it should not have to pay for its workers in their healthcare plan, workers who need or want contraception. And the court rules in favor, in some sense, in a liberal direction, by increasing the religious freedom, again, of a corporation, but significantly denies equal protection of the women, mostly women, well, all women, who would like to have birth control paid for through their healthcare plans. Okay, so one very clearly liberal decision, but then these mixed decisions of the early Roberts Court, of the initial 3 or 4 Roberts Courts, that give you the idea that they're increasing civil liberties, but are very, very politically conservative decisions. And that's where we get the current court. And this is the most recent court photo that was taken. The justices always sit or stand in order of seniority. So you will note that in the previous image, Justice Coney Barrett actually was standing over here because she was the most junior justice. Now she moves to the second most junior justice position, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sits here on the end. And I'll be more than happy to talk about her during the Q&A if you would like me to. And I didn't show the image with Justice Breyer just because I will end this by talking about the 2022 court. So I wanted you to get a sense of what this looked like. But without Justice Jackson, Justice Barrett is over here, Justice Kagan ends up standing, and Justice Breyer is sitting down here, okay, as the second most senior, third most senior justice on the bench. What does the most recent version of the Roberts Court do? And that's the 2021 cases without Justice Brown Jackson. And the court does a number of things in terms of several areas of the law. In its most infamous freedom of religion case, Kennedy versus Bremerton, or known as the praying football coach case, the court decides, and note that it's a 6-3 decision, and you're going to see this again and again and again, 6-3, where the chief is with the 5 more conservative justices, and you have the 3 liberal justices dissenting. In these cases, in this term, it's Breyer who is the dissenter, and you would suspect in the 2022 term, it will be Justice Jackson who will be that third dissenter with Sotomayor and Kagan. But in Bremerton, the court does what the Roberts Court has actually been doing since 2005. This is an Establishment Clause case. Separation of church and state. And that is, the Bremerton School District says to the football coach, it's okay if you pray. And I said to my students when we talked about Bremerton the other day, there are more prayers in any given day in public schools than you can shake a stick at, right? Just think about a physics test coming up, or a chemistry test, or if you're bad at English, a test about Chaucer. Kids are praying all the time, but they're doing privately into whomever they would like to pray, or whatever they would like to pray to. But praying on the 50-yard line after a football game as a coach, where the trial record shows that players were being punished by having playing time taken away from them if they didn't go and pray with the coach, suggests that there is a clear, too much confluence between religion and state. As a caveat, the starting quarterback was never punished, because you wouldn't punish your starting quarterback because he's usually the star of the team. So he's the one kid who didn't go pray with the coach and never got punished for it. And that's in the trial court record as well. But again, this is an Establishment Clause case, and just like with many of the other Establishment Clause cases during the Roberts Court era, they turn this into a freedom of religion case. And they say it's not about separating religion from our public schools. This is about the football coach's freedom of religion to pray wherever the hell we'd like to pray. So what happens? The 6 say, because it's a freedom of religion case, we decide in his favor because the government cannot discriminate against whatever he wants to do religiously. The question you want to ask yourself is, if it was a humanist, or if it was a Muslim, or if it was a Jew, would the same decision have been made? And I think the answer is probably apparent, but we won't know because this case was about a Christian coach. Okay. And then just one other decision, also 6-3, and this is perhaps even more devastating in terms of separation of church and state than the Bremerton decision. And in Carson versus Megan, the court says if you're going to have a state, in this case the state of Maine, that is going to allow parents to use vouchers that they get from the state to send their kids to a private non-religious school, think in Minneapolis, Blake, which is relatively near to here, you also have to give those vouchers to parents who want to send their kids to religious schools. And so despite the court saying in the early 2000s that vouchers are okay, this case, which got a whole heck of a lot less press than the praying football coach case, because that makes a better story, it's this case that's more devastating for the separation, the wall of separation between church and state, because this now says states, if they're going to give any money to help kids go to private schools, have to pay for kids to go to sectarian schools, or secular schools, sorry. Okay? So the court gives some pretty devastating blows during the 2021 term to religious freedom and the wall of separation. We also know that the court in Bruin instituted a much harsher decision, handed down a much harsher decision, again, 6-3. You're seeing the theme here, that says not only is there an individual right to bear arms, but it's going to be, as we had said in Heller 12 years ago, but it's going to be increasingly difficult for any entity, state, local, federal, to institute any regulations. The city of New York had essentially said there are sensitive places where you cannot carry guns. And we actually think that most of New York City is a sensitive place. We do not want people in a city of, 8 million people now or something like that, carrying guns around. And Justice Thomas in the decision says you cannot put a blanket over an entire city. You can pick and choose some places, and Thomas did leave the door open in the same way that Scalia and Heller 12 years ago left the door open for regulation of guns. But you can't have an all-out regulation. Unfortunately, we've already found out that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals has used Bruin and laid out a list of places where guns cannot be banned, and those include public schools, hospitals, and Times Square. You cannot ban guns from those areas in New York. And there was a list of about 10 or 11 others, but those are the ones that are probably the most damning for the court. And so while Thomas left the door open, he didn't really. The decision is really tight in terms of making it almost impossible for the government to regulate guns. The other issue with Bruin is very similar to both Dobbs, the abortion rights case I'll get to next, as well as the praying football coach case, the Kennedy case. And that is that the justices begin to take a very, very dim view of precedent. Here, Thomas says the only thing we will use to make decisions on gun cases and probably other cases beyond the Second Amendment is the history of how the Constitution was originally written or how the amendments were originally written. We don't need to look at precedent. We don't need to look at the context of the day. We don't need to look at how many people are killed on a daily basis, which was in fact the crux of Justice Breyer's dissent, because this decision was handed down days after Uvalde. Right, the massacre in Uvalde, Texas. What I didn't talk about in the Kennedy case was people are very upset about what happens in Dobbs, and that is the overturning of an almost 50-year-old precedent. Roe wasn't 50 yet. It'll be 50 this coming January 22nd. In the Kennedy case, the court overturned a 51-year-old precedent, Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was the test the court used for deciding separation of church and state cases. And Lemon is now completely dead. And one of the reasons people didn't talk about it is none of the justices since 1971 really liked Lemon. It was really difficult to apply, but the court killed it for good in the Kennedy case. But what does the court really do in the case that I'm sure most of you or many of you really want to talk about in Dobbs? It overturns one of the strongest, longest lasting precedents in the history of the United States, and that is that we are overturning not only Roe v. Wade, but then the case that is the standard bearer today, and that is Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And we are throwing back, as you all know, the freedom to obtain abortion on demand to the states, and the federal government will no longer recognize a federal liberty to obtain abortion on demand. And Justice Alito, in his decision here, says the same thing that Thomas said in Bruin, and that is the only thing that governs these cases, that is abortion rights cases, and then again insinuating all other cases as well, is historical understanding of what we were doing at the founding. And if there was no right to abortion at the founding, there can be no right to abortion in 2022. And it's not even close. It's 6-3. Now you will note, as all of you would know, because I'm sure you're here on a Saturday afternoon because you are lovers of politics and you like thinking about the law and you know what's going on in the world. You know that this decision was leaked on May 1st, and it's not handed down until June 30th. And there's all sorts of theories about who leaked and why it was leaked. My theory is still, and this will maybe stop someone from asking this as a question, I didn't mean to steal your thunder. But my theory continues to be and will be for all time until I'm proven wrong that it was Justice Alito himself who leaked it. Now, it may have been that he had one of his clerks do so, but I think he made sure to do so because it is clear from all of the reporting, the reporters who've gotten to be close to the justices, that the chief was strongly on the heels of Justice Kavanaugh in particular and Justice Coney Barrett as well to convince them to not overturn Roe. Set the ban at 15 weeks, but don't overturn Roe. Even though we know viability of a fetus is still at 24 weeks, we can live with them cutting it back to 15 weeks as long as we don't overturn Roe. Because now, while Robert saved himself from being the Chief Justice who killed Obamacare, every history book for the end of time will name him as the Chief Justice who killed Roe versus Wade. And so he was fighting with everything he had to get Kavanaugh and or Coney Barrett most likely to flip. He wasn't successful, and one of the reasons that leak probably came out from the Alito chambers was to put Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett into a corner, because it was clear that they were part of the majority opinion that was already leaked on May 1st. And now he's daring them to renege on their initial votes, and they weren't going to do it. And so, again, I've only shown you 6-3 decisions because that's what the court did throughout the crux of its 2021 term. Note, statistically, 30% of all decisions during the 2021 term were 6-3 decisions. That is the highest percentage of 6-3 decisions back to the Warren Court. We know that only 29% of the decisions during this term were unanimous. And the average during the previous 10 terms of the Roberts Court was 43%. So unanimity dropped, right, by 14%. And the 6 didn't care. I mean, the 5 didn't care. And Roberts is sort of going along for the ride because he's trying to rein them in, the conservatism in at least a little bit to save the institution. But the 5, led by Justice Thomas, don't have to listen to him anymore. Okay, and as I transition to talking about the 2022 term, this is no longer the Roberts Court. This is the Clarence Thomas Court. He's the most senior justice, and they do not need the chief's vote to do anything they want to do. There's Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. And when you have 5, nothing else matters. And in fact, it turns out, ironically, that the most liberal justice ever to sit on the bench, William J. Brennan, is the one who said it. The most important thing on the United States Supreme Court is not the law, it's the number 5. Because you need to convince 4 justices to sign your opinion to change the law and policy in the United States. You don't need 6, you just need 5. And Thomas has the other 4 he needs and never needs to talk to the chief once to do it. So, I mean, that's sort of where we are at with the U.S. Supreme Court. And what are they going to hear this term? They're going to hear the Voting Rights Act with the gerrymandering and redistricting cases that they heard their first week of arguments this term coming out of Alabama. Note, however, that there's a glimmer of hope for people who are upset, and that is actually Justice Jackson. While she is going to almost never get 5 votes to change the law, she actually took the legal theory that Justice Thomas and Justice Alito used to make decisions almost always, that is originalism, that is only looking at the history of the Constitution, and she turned it on its head during oral argument. And she said, all right, I can be an originalist just like you, but if I'm going to be an originalist, everybody needs to know that the Constitution was actually rewritten post-Civil War. When we wrote the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15, the Constitution changed 180 degrees. And now we protect equal protection, when we protect due process, when we protect voting rights. And so she took that theory and very, very strongly during those arguments. And I commend you to go and listen to the arguments. They're on the Supreme Court's website. We know, and I've done this research, that new justices, what we call, and I know it's not politically correct, but we call them this freshman justices, which are justices in the first 2 terms, they don't speak the way that Justice Jackson spoke her first oral argument. even Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, who spoke much more than other freshmen, and they were the first to really do so. And that was huge because they were also women, and we know that female justices don't speak as often as the male justices on the bench. And Justice Jackson said at this point, I really don't care. I'm going to forward my theory, and people are going to hear that theory, and did it in a very strong way. The court is going to hear this independent state legislature theory. This is all about what happened during COVID, where you had in Minnesota Steve Simon making sure that there were changes to the election laws or how elections were carried out so that people during a pandemic could make sure that they still could vote. The theory that is being forwarded is the Constitution says in Article 2 that it is only the state legislature that can make those changes. No more governors, no more state Supreme Courts, and no more secretaries of state. And if the court buys the argument about the independent state legislature phrase of the Constitution, then voting is going to change fundamentally in the United States forever. Right? Even much more so than the idea that the court's going to gut, if it can gut any more, the Voting Rights Act. So watch for this independent state legislature case on that theory, because that's going to have a massive impact on voting in the United States. The court is probably going to overturn Fisher versus Texas, and that is affirmative action for colleges and universities in a dual set of cases out of Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill. Race is not right. Race can never be a predominant factor in admission to colleges and universities. But in Fisher, Justice O'Connor said race should be one factor, or could be a factor, right? We have all these other factors. Are you a good tuba player? Are you a good actress? Are you a good football player? Are you a legacy? Have your parents given millions of dollars to the university? Oh, and you can check another box that is race, gender, ethnic origin. And it's just another little bit that we can understand that diversity is a good thing in colleges and universities. And so racism cannot be the motivating factor, but it can be a factor. In the UNC and Harvard cases, I'm going to bet you here, just like with these other two cases, although I don't make public predictions, that all three of these cases will be 6-3 and affirmative action will be dead from here on out. Okay? And then the last case I'll talk about is the court is going to get to a same-sex marriage case. It's not a case where the court is going to decide whether same-sex marriage is protected, but it's very similar to the Masterpiece Cake Shop, cake baker case from several terms ago, where now you actually have a web designer who says, I do not want to make web pages for same-sex couples' marriages. The same-sex couple is saying, well, you're violating our equal protection rights by saying you'll do a web page for anybody else, but not for a same-sex couple. The court is going to decide this, and it will be this time, although Masterpiece was not on freedom of speech or freedom of religion grounds, and in this case, the same-sex couple, there's no shot will win this case either. So these are the four major areas. There are others, but right now on the court's docket, those are the four main areas that you should watch for coming up in the 2022 term. So let me just finish. And that is a question, what do Warren and Roberts have in common? Very strong ideological majorities, one in a hardcore liberal direction, right? And again, I can name them for you: Warren, Brennan, Black, Douglas, and Marshall. 5. And then they would drag along every once in a while Byron White, who, even though he was a Kennedy appointee, was a little bit more conservative than the other. But there was a very strong 5-person majority that could do anything they wanted and never talk to the other 4 if they didn't think that they needed to. Okay? Second, both courts are deciding cases that everybody cares about. Right? I mean, yes, there continues to be unanimous decisions, but those are in cases that no one hears about: tax cases, antitrust cases, some other governmental power case that barely makes the New York Times. But when it comes to speech, religion, freedom, right to privacy, the Warren Court and now the Roberts Court are hearing those cases very similarly. And then this idea of staying together for a long period of time. I scared my students the other day because I told them that when they turn 60, and my wife and I are now in our early to mid 50s, but when my students who are 20, when they turn 60, and they could do the math, that's 40 years, Barrett and Jackson for sure will still be on the bench. Okay? I mean, barring death or something that would make them want to leave, which is probably nothing, those 2 justices for sure will be on the bench, and odds are that Kavanaugh will be as well. Gorsuch could be, but he's just a couple of years older. But there is 2 for sure, and probably up to 4 of the current 9 who will still be on the bench. in 2062. And that's very similar to the amount of time that Black and Douglas in particular sat on the bench from the late 30s to the early to mid 70s. Okay? And then finally, this idea that they regularly invoke judicial review. They strike down laws from states and local governments and the federal government in particular that they find aberrant to the Constitution. And both of these courts have these in common. And so, a couple of conclusions. Very powerful in both eras. Here's the difference. In the Warren Court, there was a senator. Even though there were 5 who didn't need to talk to the senator, they talked to Potter Stewart and Lewis Powell on a regular basis. And Powell doesn't come on during the Warren Court era. He's one of Nixon's appointees, but he comes on in the early 70s. They were spoken with on a regular basis. That is the liberal majority, would bring in the moderates. There are no more moderates on the bench. I mean, you can call Justice Kagan a moderate, and she is. She's not a liberal. Neither is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Sotomayor is the closest we have to a liberal justice. The other two are left-leaning moderates. But when the median justice on the U.S. Supreme Court is Justice Brett Kavanaugh, we are polarized to a way that we've never seen in the United States Supreme Court in its history. And finally, and I know some of you have already shaken your head, but that's the conclusion. It's going to stay very powerful. The court's going to stay very conservative, and it's going to stay very, very activist. And even though I say here in a Warren-esque way, it's actually the opposite of a Warren-esque way. It's going to stay very, very activist in a highly, highly conservative way, probably for decades to come. I appreciate your time, and I will appreciate any questions that you all have. Thank you very much.
Question here?
What do you think of the prospects for reform of the Supreme Court or adding additional, because it seems like that's the only thing that's going to change the direction of the court?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. President Biden messed that up. It should have happened in his first 100 days, right? And we know that the honeymoon period, presidents can do almost anything that they would like to do. It would have been politically unpopular to pack the court, but I think that they probably should have tried. And my argument was, and this is not from an ideological standpoint, it's from an objective court scholar standpoint, and that is that Biden could have very legitimately said, I'm going to get Congress, and again, this all would have been contingent on 2 senators, one from West Virginia and one from Arizona, agreeing to do this, but we're not going to pack the court the way Roosevelt did. Right? Remember, Roosevelt wanted to get 15 justices on the bench. He wanted 6 new appointees. And Biden very legitimately could have stood in front of the cameras and stood in front of the nation and said, I'm not packing the court. I'm going to put the court, we're going to reset the court. And it's actually a pretty legitimate argument. There was never a confirmation discussion about Merrick Garland. It just didn't happen. Because we don't do that during an election year, and then we wait, right? And the worst that happens to Mitch McConnell is that Hillary Clinton gets to appoint someone. Oh, and dirty little secret, Hillary Clinton is not a liberal the way she's portrayed in the press. She is a tried and true moderate. She would have put another moderate justice on the bench just like her husband did, because even RBG, except on women's rights, is a moderate, not a liberal. So here's my point. He'd say, look, you guys never gave Garland a chance. We want that one back. So I want to add one and get to 10. Oh, and by the way, then when Justice Ginsburg died, and we don't put anyone on the bench during a presidential election year, but we let Justice Coney Barrett have her confirmation vote a week before the election happens, you lied. We want that seat as well. And it would be a beautiful argument. We'll just go to 11 and it resets, because now instead of having 4-4 in the chief, we have 5-5 in the chief. And now you've got to convince the chief every time to try to see which side he's going to go on. And the court would have not been, liberals wouldn't have been happy with that court, but they would have been a hell of a lot more happy than they are with the court today, because it would have said, you've got to get that justice in the middle, the chief, to make any decision you want to make. I think he should have tried to have done that, and that's gone. That's not going to happen. There are other things you could do to change it, right? Put in, although these that doesn't take constitutional amendment. These would take constitutional amendment, putting in term limits, for instance. would take an amendment to Article 3, and that's not going to happen. So, should reform probably happen? Yes. Is it going to happen? No. It's just not. But it's a really good question, and it's one that I think, as Americans, we need to continue debating.
I have so many questions. In your opinion, if the independent state legislature case is decided 6-3, is our democracy effectively over?
Well, I mean, I would say not fully, because, right, remember the state legislatures that would sue to stop a governor or a state Supreme Court to not have any say in this are not a majority of the state legislatures, right? I mean, or they're close to it, I suppose. There are enough states that would not allow that to happen, or would not enforce that, if you will. And so this, I think, actually is the quintessential case of determining whether the court actually has power. Because if you get states like the state of Minnesota that say, no, the 201 people in the legislature don't know anything about how to run an election, which, to be honest, they don't, right? Elections are run at a local level, and who really knows? That's the Secretary of State, and I'm just picking on Steve Simon because he's currently our Secretary of State. He knows how to run elections, so we're going to let that happen. I do think that it will be a huge blow to democracy, and if you combine it with the gerrymandering case, I think democracy is taking maybe a mortal hit, but I'm not ready to say that it's dead yet, because I think there will be enough legislatures full of legislators who will say, no, we're not going to enforce this law.
But it only takes a couple states.
It does.
Arizona,
right.
Georgia,
right.
Nevada to say we do not
That's right.
agree with the people in our state who they voted for.
That's right.
And we don't, and they
Yes.
overturn it.
And then it would be almost impossible for the Democrats to win. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. What's going to be interesting, and I think it starts this November 8th, and it'll be even more interesting in 2024, and that is, I mean, if this case is decided the way I think it is and the way I think you think it is, I mean, a legislature can simply say, voting booths, balloting is open until 8 p.m. on election night. So let's take early voting out of it. And even if you're in line, you can't vote. You have to have had voted by 8 p.m. or your vote doesn't count. I mean, that's taking it really to hyperbole, but that could happen. And then that really is going to be a mortal wound to democracy. Yeah, that case might be the most important of the ones up there that I had up there. That and the Clean Water Act case that I decided not to talk about, because people don't like to get lost in the weeds of talking about bureaucratic agencies. But similar to the EPA case from last term, where the court stripped power from the EPA, if it strips power again from the EPA for enforcing the Clean Water Act, they're not just talking about the climate. What the six are talking about is all administrative agencies having no more power to enforce things that they do because they're not elected. But why do we have the bureaucratic state in this country? Because none of us are experts. Members of Congress are experts on nothing. And I think any member of Congress who's being honest will let you know that, right? I don't know everything. And yes, I can learn from my staff, and I can learn from interest groups, and I can learn from reading, but I'm not an expert on these 80 areas of the law. That's why we have bureaucratic agencies. It's why we have what we call lifers who are working, who stay for Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, and again and again and again, however it switches, because they're the experts. And if now the court says the experts no longer have any power, then I don't know what we're going to do for the environment or for any serious, I mean, the FCC, the FEC, the EPA, you name your alphabet soup, all that power is out the window. So those two cases, as boring as those two sort of seem, I mean, who wants to talk about an independent state legislature theory, and who wants to talk about the Clean Water Act? They seem boring. They are exactly what you think they are, and they are terribly important cases.
Anybody else?
I agree there's a lot of questions. Just an easy one. The two Trump appointees.
Yeah.
I don't know the right way to ask this question. Did they mislead? Did they lie during their hearings?
So the answer, and you could say all three of them, and the answer point blank is no. Go back and listen to the confirmation hearings, and they never said I will not vote to overturn Roe. What they said is, currently, as you asked me that question, Roe is settled law. They were very, very careful. I mean, lawyers are nothing if not savvy, right? And they were incredibly savvy in their language. There was no perjury during those confirmation hearings. Was it unethical? Was it a little bit illegitimate? Yes. But was it lying to Congress? It was not, because they never used that language, I will not overturn Roe. So it's terrible, and I think it makes all of us want to bang our heads against the wall, but they didn't. Great question.
If what happens, if what looks like is going to happen happens, what about the Supreme Court just being seen as illegitimate in this country? And okay, I suppose if they make the decisions, I mean, everything's going to fall apart. But I don't know. Does Roberts care? I mean, does he have it? Because it's going to be seen. I think, is there going to be rioting in the streets? I don't know. I mean, but this is a very bleak situation that you have painted, even though I was aware a lot of this, but as you put it all together and paint it, it's very bleak. But if that does happen and this takes its course, I think the court will be seen totally as illegitimate for, over 50% of our population.
You're right.
And couldn't something else happen? Maybe there will be an amendment.
I mean, the problem is that Congress is so gridlocked right now that an amendment probably is unlikely. So you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and then you need 3/4 of the states or 3/4 of state constitutional conventions, and that is nearly impossible in this day and age to get those institutions in motion to do that. But yeah, I mean, the court is already seen as illegitimate, and I think Roberts is sick to his stomach on a daily basis, because I will say this. And I used the words before, but they were sort of throwaway words. Roberts is an institutionalist. He believes that the chief justiceship is like the presidency, and that is that the office is larger than the person, right? And he wants the Roberts court era to be known as a great court era. He has great reverence for the institution. The problem is that he allowed things to, not that he could stop the 3 Trump appointees, but he allowed decisions to be made earlier on, beginning in 2005, that set the course for all of this to happen. And so he sort of is the one who set the groundwork for taking the court's knees out from under it. And now he can't stop it. Now he's just going to sit and watch the train run by him, because it's Thomas's court, not his. Here's what's going to happen. We're just not going to listen to the Supreme Court. And I'll give you 2 examples, right? There's the mythology of Andrew Jackson, where he says to John Marshall, late in Marshall's tenure, Marshall still had a decade left on the bench, but during the Trails of Tears case, the president says, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Right? We're marching the Cherokee across and other tribes across to the worst land in the United States in the middle of Oklahoma. And Marshall says you can't do that. It violates the treaties, it violates the Constitution. And you can imagine Andrew Jackson saying, so who's got the guns? Right? I've got the guns, you've got some black robes. So I dare you, in your black robes, old man, 10 years from his death, to come out and stop my military from moving the Cherokee. Not going to happen. Now let me give you a less bleak example of that. The court decides a case out of Santa Fe School District in 2000. You can Google it, I'm bad with dates. And it was a school of prayer case. And so this is 5 years before Roberts, but it's the Rehnquist court era. And Santa Fe School District says, in that case, it was not a praying football coach. It was students reading school-sponsored prayers over the PA system before the Friday Night Lights football game began. And some folks of a different religion, I actually think it may have been a Unitarian family and a Jewish family, but don't quote me on that. Again, it's easy enough to Google, sued and said, right, this violates the separation of church and state. The Supreme Court ruled actually in those litigants' favor and said, yeah, you can't have school-sponsored prayer. Like our precedents, I read you a couple of them from the 60s at the beginning of my talk, are clear. The school cannot sponsor prayers before a football game where everybody and their brother, sister, aunt, and uncle are at the game. But I guarantee you this, if you go south of the Mason-Dixon or go into the depths of Texas on a Friday night to a football game, or if you go to the far southwest corner of Minnesota Friday night likes football, you are apt, not always, but you are apt to hear a prayer read over the PA system before a game. What are they doing? They're ignoring United States Supreme Court precedent. But what's going to happen is, per your question, Audrey, on a much larger scale. Right? And we're just going to have people saying, we're not going to listen anymore. We're not going to do it. And yeah, it's nice that the court has now handed down another ruling. We're just going to go on with our lives. And that then is another blow to democracy, because the court is actually meant to, one of the reasons it's anti-democratic. It's the one of our branches that's anti-democratic, right? These folks are not accountable to anyone. They're not reelected. They sit for life tenure. That's meant to protect the rights of minority groups, whatever the minority group might be. And people just aren't going to listen anymore, and that's going to be problematic. I don't know if it'll lead to rioting on the streets, but it is going to certainly lead to, all right, fine. You want to let South Dakota ban abortion? We are going to have this GoFundMe account that now has close to $1 million in it to help build this clinic right across the river. We're going to stick it in your eye, and we're going to have that in Minnesota. And all the women in South Dakota who can't get an abortion legitimately there, legally there, can come here.
North Dakota.
Or North Dakota. You're right. Sorry. I don't know why I was thinking South Dakota, but yes, across from Fargo. And that's what's going to happen. So it's probably not rioting in the streets, but you're going to get a very bifurcated nation. And now we talk about red and blue states now, you will seriously see red and blue states where rights are given in states like Minnesota and they're surrounded by North and South Dakota and Wisconsin that are not going to give those same sorts of rights. So yeah, whatever the result, whether it does ultimately lead to rioting or just this, we have different rights in every other part, all these different parts of the nation. It's not going to be the way that our nation was conceived. So.
I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Talking about the size of the court, do you think there's any logic in the size changing, or that it should be tied to population, or is 9 a good number?
Look, 9's a good number because it's been set since 1869. It's historical as to why it's that number. But let me give you, cause the reason the number has changed in the court has always been political. So we actually it started with 6, which was a dumb number because it was even, and we know you get ties much more often with even numbered groups. And it jumps up to 7, and it's at 7 for a long time. And then it jumps up right before the Civil War because the Republicans wanted to make sure that there was a majority of Northerners on the Supreme Court. So we go to 10. So that's a beautiful political move, right? Let's make sure that there's not a majority of Southerners when we're going to now essentially go to war with the South. When Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson comes into office, everybody, and I'll use this phrase again, aunt, uncle, grandmother, grandfather, whomever, brother, sister, hated Andrew Johnson. Everybody hated Andrew Johnson. So what does Congress do? They actually cut the number back to 7. Now, nobody got fired because you sit for life tenure, but when there was a death or a retirement, President Johnson didn't get to put anyone on the bench. Then when Johnson gets out of office and things are sort of normalized during Reconstruction, as normal as they could be during Reconstruction, Congress jumped the number in 1869, 2 years later, back up to 9. And just historically, once the country sort of made sure that FDR, and the country didn't do it, it was one Supreme Court justice, didn't get to jump the number up to 15, we just assume that 9 is a good number. We certainly don't want the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit has 27 judges on it. We don't want 27 Supreme Court justices.
Is that sort of a way that it filters through with more opinions and
Yeah.
First, I have a little announcement. Everyone will be pleased to know that at the end of the legislative session, some legislators introduced a bill called Coach Kennedy's Law, which will specifically authorize athletes to play on the field. So, we will be
play or pray.
Pray on the field. Yeah. So we'll be taking a look at that. But my question is, there was an article in Slate a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you saw it, about how traumatized law professors are right now because of the recent Supreme Court shenanigans. And it's a really long article, but I'll just read a little bit of it, just a few sentences. The problem is not that the Supreme Court is issuing decisions which left-leaning professors disagree. It's that the court seems to be reaching many of these conclusions in defiance of centuries of standards, rejecting precedent and moderation in favor of aggressive, partisan-tinged, motivated reasoning. And the gist of the article was that it's now hard or challenging for constitutional law professors to know how to teach the law. And I'm just wondering if you have faced that yourself. Are you okay?
Yes, I'm fine, although I will tell you, so, right, for those of you who went to college, or even in high school, you'll remember syllabus day, right? The first day of class, you did nothing, a professor would go over his or her syllabus, and then they'd let you go on your way after 15 minutes. And for the first time this year in my common law class, I told them straight off the bat, we're going to be here the whole 75 minutes. And they sort of asked why. I said, because I've got to give you this sort of lecture to begin the semester that I've never had to give before. And it was a 70-minute lecture, close to it, on precedent not really mattering anymore. Because all we do in common law, and all you do in law school common law classes, is read precedents to understand how the law builds on itself. And so I said, all right, here's what happened in Kennedy, here's what happened in Dodge, here's what's happening in Bruin. And this court, as the article in Slate says, indicates that precedent doesn't matter to the justices anymore, at least the six. And then the other interesting word that is used in that article that you read part of today is partisanship, right? The court has always been ideological. And we can have those battles. The court has always held itself above partisanship. And today the court is not ideologically conservative, it is partisanly conservative. And I know partisanly is not a word, but you get my point. That it is, and there is a difference between partisanship and ideology. Now we know that they're highly correlated right now in the United States. But if you want to make a highly liberal or highly conservative argument that is based on principled arguments, then I may disagree with you, but I can understand the principled argument you're making, and I can appreciate it, and I can maybe fight back against it, but at the end of the day, right, you've got justification. But once we get into partisanship, that party is more important than the law, or party is more important than the United States, now you've got a problem. And the one institution that eschewed partisanship has now let it seep under its doors, and that's where the problem really comes in.
I think there was a restructuring concept that I first heard from Secretary Buttigieg. 15 judges, 5 from each side, and then the judges themselves choose 5 for the center. Can you tell me whether you think such a thing is possible and how it would be, how it could come about?
Right, so it's not possible without a constitutional amendment because, in fact, the Constitution says that Congress gets to set the number of justices. So unless Secretary Buttigieg can get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass the initial version of that amendment and then get 3/4 of the states to ratify it, that it just isn't going to happen just because Article 3 is so clear that it is Congress that sets the number. And ironically, the number of justices is actually also not in Article 3. Article 3 says that Congress shall create one Supreme Court and all inferior, the judiciary shall have one Supreme Court and all inferior courts as Congress sees fit. So as I say to my students, the only court that Article 3 calls for is the Supreme Court. And that insinuates, in fact, that you don't even need 3 judges on a bench, because to run a court, you only need 1. So we could have 1 federal judge in the United States. Now, of course, with a country of 400 million people, that's me just being jerky and being hyperbolic about getting rid of all of the judges. But that, a strict reading of Article 3 says that that's what we could have in this country. But no, to get to what he wants to do, it would take constitutional amendment and pretty difficult to do. The better route for court packing or changing to get maybe a moderate wing of the court back again is just to have Congress pass a law that says we're going to change the number. Yeah.
Could Clarence Thomas have a problem for not recusing himself from a case that involved his wife?
No. And here's the reason. The canon of judicial ethics for federal courts only applies to federal district courts, that is the trial courts, and the federal courts of appeals. The standard of judicial ethics does not apply to the United States Supreme Court, and it never has. And the justices lobby again and again to make sure that Congress doesn't pass such a law, because the 9 believe that they can always decide what is most ethical. So Justice Thomas says, I can decide objectively, despite the fact that my wife was involved in January 6th. I believe there's some evidence that she was. And nobody can stop him. His colleagues can try to persuade him. But once the only person who decides whether you recuse is the justice themselves. And I'll give you 3 examples. The most prominent reason justices recuse themselves from cases is financial. And they always will do so. And it's one of my favorite cases of all time, for those of you who are baseball fans, Flood versus Kuhn. When Curt Flood, from the greatest baseball team in the history of Major League Baseball, the St. Louis Cardinals, had Curt Flood as their center fielder, there was not free agency. And to say that baseball players were indentured servants is sort of a disservice, because even in that day they were making a lot of money. But Flood said, I don't want a team to own me, and I get traded wherever I want only when the owner decides. So I'm suing for free agency. And Kuhn, K-U-H-N, was Bowie Kuhn. Those of you who were baseball aficionados in the 60s and into the 70s, Bowie Kuhn was commissioner of baseball, and so he sued. I would commend you, before I get to the reason why this is about recusal, to read the beginning of Harry Blackman's opinion in Flood versus Kuhn, if you like baseball at all, because Blackman actually began that opinion with an ode to baseball. He talked about Casey at the bat, and then he started listing all the greatest baseball players of all time. It's very strange for a Supreme Court opinion, but he had not, in his initial list, listed any African Americans. And Thurgood Marshall called him and said, excuse me? Like, there's no Satchel Paige, there's no Hank Aaron, there's no Jackie Robinson. And Blackman realized his mistake and added all those folks in. At any rate, Lewis Powell is on the bench at the time when this case comes in 71, 72 to the court. And he owned stock in Anheuser-Busch. And at the time, Anheuser-Busch still owned the Cardinals. And he wrote a memo, which I have in my archives in my office, that says to his colleagues, I have to recuse myself from this case because I own stock in Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch owns the Cardinals, and I could benefit from a decision we make in this case. So that's one. Always financial, they're going to get rid of. So anytime Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband's firm argued a case at the court, she would recuse, because she didn't want her husband's firm to gain financially from a win. And then there's other reasons. There's the Thomas reason, which is very akin to the Scalia reason. So when the court decided the Dick Cheney case, where he had had these secret meetings with oil companies, and the Sierra Club sued in 05, 06 to get the transcripts from those meetings, Scalia had gone duck hunting in Texas with Vice President Cheney like 2 months before that case was heard. And Scalia said, any fool who thinks I can't be objective after just duck hunting with a guy is a fool, is really a fool. And so Scalia didn't recuse. On the other hand, when the court decided a really controversial religion case, and I forget, no, it was the Pledge of Allegiance case, I believe. Well, it was a religion case. Scalia had given this really damning speech about his views on that case in particular, as well as on freedom of religion, the August before that term started, and he realized that he had gone so far over the edge that he did recuse himself. But Thomas is going to continue to say, we never talked about it. It has nothing to do with the court case. It doesn't matter what has happened. I'm not going to recuse. So the bottom line, that's because none of my questions are ever, or none of my answers are ever simple. My wife knows that as well. He's the only one who decides, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, you could get Congress to try to impeach him, but there's not votes to do that. And the Republicans are going to probably win the House in 3.5 weeks anyway, and so there would be no appetite for impeachment. Yeah.
Do I recall correctly that 5 of the 6 conservatives are Catholic?
Yes, and Gorsuch is not. Gorsuch grew up Catholic, but he attends an Anglican church now, so he is not.
Catholic light?
But yes, Catholic light, so yeah.
So it seems to me the problem of teaching constitutional law isn't hard, it's quite simple. Their decisions are made by Catholic values. Tell me I'm wrong.
So I would argue that in fact, it's not, I mean, I think that their decisions are very Catholic, but not with a capital C. I think their decisions come out of the law training that these folks have, and that is the originalist school of legal thought. Now, in religion cases in particular, in an abortion case, you can assume that there's some religiosity that has creeped into their decisions, but it's much more about their just ardent belief that the only thing that matters is the original words of the Constitution and nothing else. The other part that comes with, and I don't think you're fully wrong, right? I think there's absolutely something to your question. The other problem is the YHS problem. And the YHS problem is the Yale, Harvard, Stanford problem. And in fact, today it's only the YH problem, that all of the justices went to Yale or Harvard. And Yale is a much more conservative school, much more likely to argue in this originalist theory. But I was not against Justice Jackson being Biden's nominee, but I was actually, and at this point, because the confirmation hearings are done and she's on the court, if someone remembers, you can shout it out. I was for the South Carolina Supreme Court justice. And the reason I was in her favor was that she has a law degree from a state school. And I think we need people on the court from public institutions. We need people who were not lifelong judges in the federal court system. We need people who are not lifelong originalists. And so what we really need, we need diversity on the bench, right? Women make up a majority of people in the United States that are still not a majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, although they are on the Minnesota Supreme Court. We certainly need diversity racially and ethnically, but what we really need is diversity of legal thought.
But isn't originalism just the most convenient form of argument to make the arguments that they want to make from that value set?
So I would agree with you 100% on that. The problem is that that's not always 100% true, and I'll give you an example. In one of the court's COVID-argued cases, it was and I'm going to blank on the name. Again, someone can yell it out if you would like to. It'll come to me at some point. This was the case about who controls criminal cases on tribal land in Oklahoma. Okay? The decision is written by Justice Gorsuch, who is the third leading originalist on the bench. His decision is one of the most liberal decisions the Roberts Court has handed down in 5 years. Why? Because he actually said the entire western half of Oklahoma belongs to the Native American tribes who live there, because if you read as an originalist the literal meaning of the words of the treaties that they signed when they were forced to go to Oklahoma, they own those damn lands. And so if there's a criminal case, it's the Native courts that get to control and not the state courts.
Any other element of ownership. Right? That land's not getting turned over to them.
It's not, but the legal system is getting turned over to them. Right? So now the court is hearing another case this term on a similar issue, and Gorsuch is going to win again. I almost guarantee Gorsuch. I never would have said this.
So oil rights, mineral rights, and all the white people are going to get pushed out of all of it, and they're just going to get pushed out, and it's all going to.
That's going to be what the court's going to have to decide. Yeah. Now I don't think it's going to happen either. But an originalist can get to where Gorsuch did when you read a treaty the way that he read it. I don't think you're wrong. And I don't think they're pushing all the white people off those lands.
Okay, so we're at 4:30. We're going to have one last question from Ross here and then wrap up, and then we'll have our social hour, and we'll get things going with that.
And I'm going to apologize right off the bat. We are not going to stay for your social hour. If anyone wants to come and talk and say hi or whatever, I'm welcome to do that. But our middle son is home from college. He's only home for 2 days, and I got to get home to make dinner because he picked a particular dinner for his birthday, and I need to make sure that everything gets done and cooked by the time. University of Missouri is in the journalism school at the University of Missouri, which he will tell you, and he is not wrong, is the #1 journalism school in the country.
All right. Yeah.
So maybe this is a good question to end on, because it's coming back to the core changes of the court and this idea of precedent. And I always hear this term legal precedent, right? For non-lawyers, for non-legal people, can you explain the standing of precedent as a legal, I don't know, term, legal construct? What is precedent, and why can it be ignored?
That's a great question. Really good. Really two good questions. So precedent comes straight from the English common law system, where everything, actually I'll put it the opposite, nothing was written down in the English common law system. Right? And until recently, by that I mean the last 75 to 80 years, probably 50 to 60 years, almost everything that happened in the British legal system happened orally. There weren't legal briefs filed that there are, like there are at the US Supreme Court. Arguments just happened orally, and then judges would hand down their decisions orally as well. So precedent started with that system, because if everything is oral and not written down and not codified, then I need to know that if your cattle came onto my land and ate all of my hay, and the judge in that case, when I sued the hell out of you, said I owe you 87 krugerrands, we need to know that that much hay is worth 87 krugerrands, even if you're accounting for inflation 10 years later. So it keeps the law stable, it keeps the law predictable. But even once we started writing things down, the idea was, and this is one of the reasons Article 3 is so short. Article 3 of the Constitution is only 375 words. And part of it was the arrogance of the framers. They're like, well, we're all lawyers. We know how a legal system should work. We don't need to lay this stuff out very much. So they don't lay it out very well, but what they do assume is that everybody's going to use this idea of the old English common law system, and the top courts in the land at the time did so, the Virginia Supreme Court and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And once they started writing opinions down, they said, well, we should stick with precedent, but it's easier to stick with precedent because now I don't need to remember how many krugerrands that particular case is about, or a similar case. I can just go back and look at what a judge said. So the idea is we expect this stability, and we expect that we are not going to change things willy-nilly, so precedent should control. There's a debate on the Supreme Court about when something becomes a super precedent, that is, it should never be overturned, and that was going to be a debate that didn't turn out to be really one, about Roe. Was Roe a super precedent because it had been around so long? Yeah. The problem, and this is where I'll end, is the only people who decide whether precedent applies and whether they can ignore precedent are the 9. And we can't do anything about it except get different people into office to nominate different people to the US Supreme Court. So was it right that we overturned Plessy with Brown? Yes. Was Justice Alito right to use the Brown overturning of Plessy as an analogy for Dobbs overturning Roe? No. Why? Because when Plessy was overturned, we were increasing people's rights. Dobbs, and this is true, is the first case in the US Supreme Court's entire history where it overturned a precedent to take away people's rights. So it's a conundrum, because precedent should be a controlling factor, but if they don't want it to be, they can simply ignore it, and they often do.
But only the Supreme, other courts can't?
Well, no, other courts can't, and this is what's interesting, right? So we've run out of time, but I'll do this quickly. About 750,000 cases actually down here in any given year in federal trial courts. About 75,000 cases in the circuit courts of appeals. Only about 75 cases, this is for easy math, go to the US Supreme Court. These judges down at the lower court, right, in those over 400,000 cases, they actually will shirk precedent on a regular basis because the probability of getting that case all the way to the Supreme Court is so little. So you'll see ignoring a precedent at the lower courts, and it's even worse in state Supreme Courts because the probability is just so tiny of having the Supremes take a case. So precedent, I will say this, 95% of the time it's followed and it's governed, but if I want to get to an outcome that precedent tells me I can't, I sometimes might ignore it so I can still get to that. It's a really wonderful question, but it takes me 2 or 3 75-minute periods to talk about precedent. I'm going to do like 30 seconds, but I appreciate it. Thank you.